I'm a detransition male, and today I want to talk about autogynephilia, repression, detransition, integration, how to deal with autogynephilia in a healthy way. Now, obviously, I'm only really capable of giving my own perspective on this topic, but as someone who transitioned, who tried to deal with my own autogynephilia via the pathway of transition, and then ultimately detransition, I wanted to kind of give my perspective. What is the healthy way to deal with this? There are some people in the gender critical world or in the conservative world who basically feel that the healthiest thing to do is to fully repress. So you have these desires, you want to feminize. There's a underlying erotic or romantic feeling that has to do with that desire. And the question is it possible to fully repress that desire such that you never feminize, you never engage in that desire? In my personal experience, it is not possible to repress fully. Now, obviously, I came to terms with my male sex, my natal sex, my biological reality, and I learned to not hate my male body because that was one of the big driving factors behind my medical transition was I sort of came to associate my male body with all these negative things. I'm going to use she her pronouns. I'm going to sort of try and integrate myself into the opposite sex gender role in society. I'm using female spaces, female name. I do not think that was the best way for me to deal with my autogynephilia. It was not necessarily healthy to run away from my sex, to run away from my male body. And I think ultimately that was born out of a inability to integrate my femininity into my image of myself as a man. When I first started dealing with all this gender stuff like 9 years ago, my therapist basically she put this idea that I'm trans and that transition is the right solution, taking on this whole elaborate social identity because I wanted to be feminine and I wanted to be public about it because I didn't want to necessarily hide the fact that I wanted to cross dress. But that cross dressing was not something that I saw as compatible with a male identity. And there was this easy social role that I felt was the only pathway for me to express myself as a feminine male, which was the trans identity. That social identity is acceptable in our society, particularly in liberal progressive circles, which were the circles that I ran in at that time. Over the years, that social identity as a trans woman involved, I thought at the time, trying to, have people perceive me to be female, to use female spaces. I use like the female bathroom. And that ultimately caused more harm than good. Like, it just caused a level of self-consciousness. I became overly obsessive in regards to this idea that I need to pass. I need to be more and more feminine. And the more I transitioned, the more I tried to be feminine, the worse my hatred of myself became, the more dysphoric I became. So that led to neuroticism and self consciousness, such that, I wasn't able to be myself. I was always on guard. There was this background anxiety in regards to passing of, people finding out that, I'm trans. And, I think if I had more role models or examples of males who have autogynephilia, who, accept their male body, accept their male sex, and just are just feminine males who don't take on a feminine social identity, who just, use male spaces, use their male identity, who are not in denial, I think I wouldn't have gone down that social path. I wouldn't have been delusional in regards to who I am. I would have grounded myself in reality. It caused my dysphoria to get worse. The more I transitioned, the more I hated things about myself, the more I tried to hide who I was. And it wasn't just safety, because I live in a liberal urban center where there's not really safety concerns. It was all in my head. It was all self-consciousness of my own doing. When I detransitioned, I basically realized that like I need to accept who I am, accept my maleness. Now, during my detransition process, I kind of attempted to repress. I thought that I could repress my femininity, that I can just be this masculine guy, this macho guy. I don't think that was healthy either. I don't also think I need to do this like full time. I don't need to express myself in a feminine way all the time. I wouldn't necessarily, go to work like this. I wouldn't necessarily, go to the grocery store like this because I like the idea of not having to put on this construction. This is all a artifice. This is all a construction. I have to shave my face, to put on makeup, and it's not like my natural self. Whereas now, you know, identifying as a guy, like accepting myself as a man, this essentially just becomes like playtime. It's fun. I like doing this. It's sort of like part of, my expression. And I can leave it in the bedroom if I want to. I can leave it in the house. I don't have this idea that, oh, I need to modify my voice. I need to change the way I express myself. I need to worry about hiding my Adam's apple. I need to try and pretend that I'm female. And I feel like this is much more healthy. One, there were, serious health consequences from being on estrogen. I had a pulmonary embolism. I had elevated triglycerides that led to pancreatitis. Being on my natural hormonal system is so much more healthier. And like, so I feel better. I have more vitality, more physical vigor, and I'm not plugged into the medical system. I'm no longer a lifelong medical patient. And I just don't think it's worth it to become a lifelong medical patient just so that you can express femininity. That's just not worth it. I think it is, all things considered, better to be natural, to not be dependent on the pharmaceutical industry, to not be dependent on, getting blood tests all the time or going to the doctor all the time. If you're physically healthy, just stay the way you are. For example, I like to exercise. I like to lift weights. Like being physically healthy was incongruous with like my social identity, because as a naturally male person, the testosterone in my body led to more muscle gain. And I always wanted to diminish that. I wanted to make myself smaller. I wanted to make myself weaker. I wanted to make myself physically less capable in order to live up to this socially constructed idea that I was trying to play out. The most fundamentally unhealthy aspect of the trans identity is this obsession with passing. The whole like non-binary thing, that is itself like just a distorted, confused way to just express yourself as a male. You don't need to buy into all this language and confusion in regards to, oh, I'm not male, I'm not female, I'm non-binary. Just no, you like just express yourself as a feminine male. And you can be masculine as feminine as you want. I don't have to repress all this either, because I think that is the other thing that is dangerous for detransitioners, is to try and like swing the pendulum in the other way, to fight against your own desires to feminize. That just leads to rumination and obsession and neuroticism. But you have to, be sensible about this. There's definitely like some AGPs out there who just, go way too in the fetishistic component, and they put it into the public world. They just sort of like are unable to control their sexual impulses, and that is unhealthy in and of itself. So to some extent, there needs to be some moderation, because ultimately all this has its like roots in the erotic, roots in the sexual. So you have to learn to contain that to some extent, and you want to express that in a way that is normal and sane, like, not going to cause discomfort to people. And definitely don't go into opposite sex spaces. Like, let female spaces be female spaces. If you're going to express yourself in a gender non-conforming way, just learn to go into the male spaces. If I was going out like this in public, I would use like the male space. Like, there's no reason for me to go into the female space. The more we normalize feminine males, the more we normalize gender nonconforming males, then the easier it will be for males to use male spaces, and for females to keep the female space protected for females. That's how it ought to be. So part of what I want to do is sort of normalize the idea that if you have AGP, just learning to accept yourself, learning to express yourself, and maintaining a male identity and not feeling like it's necessary to adopt this trans identity as a social container for your expression of yourself. And we just need to get over the idea that transness is the answer to these desires, because it's not. It leads to problems, it leads to inauthenticity. Despite the trans narrative, it's like, oh, we're being authentic to ourselves. No, you are running away from your natural state of being. You are running away from your natural identity. You're running away from ontology, from the reality of who you are. The whole social construction of this artificial identity, trying to pretend that you're a woman, trying to pretend that you're this like trans person, when in reality, just there's nothing wrong with just accepting that you are a man who has a predilection for femininity. There's nothing wrong with that. That is what drove me to take on the medical pathway, which was ultimately destructive to my health and well-being. One of the things I'm working on is like getting over my shame. So I think shame is what drives people into transition. The hatred of masculinity, the hatred of maleness and femininity, drives you into the trans identity, because the trans identity is one of the only socially acceptable narratives for feminine males, particularly if you're not gay, if you're not homosexual, if you're just like, attracted to women and you want to be feminine. It is very hard to do that in a way that doesn't induce shame. And even admitting that that often has its roots in the erotic, because the femininity has its roots in the erotic, people want to like destigmatize that through the trans identity. But we need to just acknowledge the reality of autogynephilia, acknowledge the reality that the healthy integration of autogynephilia and femininity can exist in a male person, and you don't need to go down the medical pathway. You don't need to transition. I don't want to generalize my experience and say like, oh, like, no trans person can ever be happy, going down the medical pathway, particularly if you're an adult and you're mentally stable. But I just feel like it leads you to try and be something that you're not. It leads you to use female spaces. It leads you to sort of confuse language, and it sort of eliminates the idea that you can just be a autogynephilic male who, who doesn't try and take on this like constructed false identity of being a woman or being a trans woman, which I think is running away from the reality of oneself as a man. It like morally bludgeons people into believing these things because they're compelled to do that out of fear of being labeled as transphobic. They're compelled to see you in a certain way, even if that violates the reality, because they want to be nice to you. And, I think we're sort of like just like challenging reality. And I think it's just like healthier to just ground your identity in what is real and what is empirical. I am an autogynephilic male who likes to express myself in a feminine way, and that doesn't take away from my manhood. And that there's nothing wrong with being a man. There's nothing, diseased about being a man. Testosterone is not a poison. Testosterone is not a disease. Being a man is not a bad thing. Being a feminine man is not a bad thing. I think we want to make space for that in our society. And the more we do that, the more we can get away from all this gender ideology nonsense that tries to confuse the meaning of words and tries to convince us that men can be women and males can be female. It encroaches on female spaces, on female rights, sports and bathrooms and single sex spaces. And so anyway, that's sort of my rant for, for this video. And yeah, I just want to make space for males to be feminine, because that is what drove me to transition in the first place.